So in this video, we're going to be talking about a 3-step process for achieving perfect exposure in your photography and video work. The other day I was on a shoot where we only had access to a location for about 2 hours. And if you've ever been in a situation like that, it can be really hectic. And in this particular situation, within that 2-hour window, we were trying to shoot a bunch of video content and a bunch of still photography, all with individual setups and individual lighting conditions. And so that situation got me thinking about the way I approach exposure and sort of the 3 main things that I'm always looking at when I'm exposing for a scene, just to make sure that I have the maximum amount of color information when I go to edit those things in post. When handling the exposure of a scene, there are typically 3 things that I keep in mind at all times. And I'm going to refer to these things as the 3 M's. It's kind of an easy way to remember them. So let's start with metering your image and talk about how you can do that most effectively. Metering your subject is just referring to the process of using your camera's internal meter to balance the exposure for middle gray on the brightest part of your subject. I find that it's easiest to use the spot metering mode because you can be very precise about where that meter reading is coming from. And what I like to do, let's say I'm shooting some portraits, is I'll take that spot meter and I'll aim it at the brightest part of the subject's face, for instance. And you just want to adjust your exposure until that brightest part of their face reads as being 0 or middle gray on your camera's meter. Exposing for the brightest part of your subject will give the overall scene a good exposure balance, and it'll retain the most information for when you're editing in post. So the next M is monitoring your highlights. And it's important to monitor your highlights because, while it's sometimes easier to recover information in the shadows, if you have clipped highlights in your imagery, you're typically not going to be able to bring that information back when, you're color correcting your images later on. Monitoring your highlights can be done in a few different ways, but my personal favorite is using the zebra overlay in your camera settings. If you have the ability to activate zebras in your camera, this essentially creates an overlay on your camera's monitor where you can see a sort of strobing series of lines over the top of any areas that are completely clipped in your image. So with the zebras activated, you want to just adjust your exposure to minimize them as much as possible. And if you're able to adjust your exposure in a way that eliminates them completely while not compromising your image or making it too dark, then that's definitely the way to go. But if you aren't able to salvage all your highlights, say some light coming in through a window or maybe a really bright sky, that's okay. But having the zebra readout allows you to make those decisions and know as you're shooting your images that you won't have those highlights and you won't have that color information when you go to work on those images later on. But on the other hand, if you do know that you want to retain the information, say, that you see through a bright window, then you can underexpose in that case to make sure that you have that information, you can bring it back. This will give you the opportunity to make the decision to underexpose your subject, knowing that you can boost the shadows in post, but you'll ultimately have that highlight detail there so that you can, further manipulate that however you want to. So the last M for nailing perfect exposure is maximizing your dynamic range. And the first part of maximizing your dynamic range is to first look and just make sure that you're shooting in the highest fidelity quality that your camera can put out. If your camera can shoot raw stills and raw video, then you want to make sure that before you start shooting that this option is activated in your camera's menu. Because I know personally I've been in the situation where I go on a photo shoot and I have a bunch of amazing photos that I've taken, and I only realized later on that I captured all of those photos as JPEGs and I have almost no color information to work with, and that's just a really heartbreaking thing to have happen if you have some amazing photos that you're really excited to edit. Now, if the camera you're shooting on doesn't have the ability to shoot raw stills or raw video, that's okay. You can try to shoot your imagery in the flattest picture profile possible so that when you take those files into post, even if they are JPEGs or if they are low quality MP4 videos, you can still have some room to work and some room to manipulate them because you're coming from a place where you don't have, really deep shadows or bright highlights, and you can typically squeeze more out of images that are shot in a flat profile like that. A secondary thing that you can do to maximize the dynamic range of what you're shooting is to just keep in mind the ISO that you're using to shoot with. So it's not always ideal to keep your camera's ISO at the lowest setting, because while that does eliminate noise in your image, it also reduces the dynamic range of your image, right? So you end up with sort of a higher contrast, crunchier image and less room between the darkest parts of your image and the brightest parts of your image. So I found shooting on various camera types that somewhere between like 650 and 1000 ISO will give you the maximum dynamic range for the sensor that you're using. And usually that sweet spot is going to be slightly different between you know, a bright daylight scene and a darker night scene. But do tests in both lighting scenarios and figure out where your camera gives you the highest performance. So that way, when you are on a shoot, you know that in this particular lighting situation, this ISO is going to give you the best performance from your camera. If you're interested in learning more about specific camera settings to use when you're shooting in available light, I'm gonna go ahead and put a video on the screen that you should definitely check out. If you're new to this channel and you're interested in learning photography and filmmaking techniques, please make sure to subscribe. And if you learned something new in this video, please let me know by giving it a thumbs up and leaving a comment below. I'll see you all in the next video.